This is Luisa Valiela of the Water Division of EPA, and also recently um, chair of the advisory committee for the Restoration Authority. We're advisory committee to the governing board, and this is the first of the webinars that the advisory committee will be holding. Thank you all for attending, and as you may know, we do have other webinars planned for May 16th and June 12th, so please get them on your calendars if you haven't already. We are offering this information sharing forum to advisory committee members, governing board members, and the public at large, so that we may all be as fluent as possible on the current state of science as we engage on issues relevant to Restoration Authority business. And first and foremost, water quality and wetlands restoration are closely linked and will help us to provide the advisory capacity that we want to on these issues to the governing board. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce our presenters today, both from the San Francisco Estuary Institute. First up will be Phil Trowbridge, who took the reins of our preeminent San Francisco Bay Regional Monitoring Program in 2014. Phil manages a team of scientists that monitor the health of San Francisco Bay, which includes testing bay waters, sediment, and wildlife for toxic contaminants. Phil will be presenting accumulations of decades worth of data. After Phil, we will have Jeremy Lowe, a coastal geomorphologist with 30 years of experience planning and designing wetlands restoration projects here and around the world. And he is a senior scientist with SFEI. You will note by his accent that he hails from across the pond and is currently focused on helping us prepare our wetlands for rising sea levels, which is what a majority of his portion of the talk will focus on, changing the paradigm of thinking of sediment as a pollutant to a much needed resource. As well, he's focused on reusing treated wastewater in marshes and uplands. Oh. So Jeremy's letting us know that the audio is breaking up a lot and I am not audible, and I am like right next to the phone, so I apologize for that. I'll even try to get closer to the speaker. So just a few webinar logistics. We are going to keep the attendees on mute, so you will only hear the presenters talk, and during the question and answer portion of the presentations, if you could use your question box, I will repeat the questions that we can see and have the presenters speak to that. Given the amount of people on the call, that's what we're hoping can manage background noise the best. And just to let you know that in the course of Phil's talk, he will pause at certain points to allow for questions. So we're really wanting to solicit your questions and allowing plenty of time for that. With that, I hope you can hear me better, and please let us know in the question section if, as the presenters talk, you're having the same issue that you can't hear them very well. Please let us know, and we will try to troubleshoot. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Phil Trowbridge.
Thank you, Louisa, and good morning, everyone. Louisa, could you do a mic check for me and confirm that I'm sounding pretty clear to you?
Yes, you sound very clear.
Okay. Well, great. Well, welcome, everyone. It's my pleasure to give this presentation, which will be an overview related to water quality in San Francisco Bay. Just to get us oriented to what we're going to cover and about how long it's going to take, we have about 50 slides, and we're going to be covering some just general background about the Institute and the RMP, and then moving into the main part of the talk, which will be about pollutants of concern of the Bay. So these are things like PCBs and mercury and nutrients and the types of water quality issues that we're dealing with in the Bay. And then the next section on sediment quality and quantity. So this is another part of the regional monitoring program, is not just measuring water quality, but also the movement and the quality of the sediment in the Bay. And then wrapping up with a section that Jeremy's going to present on a bigger picture view of sediment as a resource and some of the related, how that is relevant to water quality. And we tried to view, that's a big topic, and we tried to view it through the lens of water quality. I think realistically about 50 slides will take 40 minutes or so, and that includes some stopping along the way. We just think that would be better to check in rather than presenting for 40 minutes and then finding out that someone had a basic question a little further back. So I'll take those, I'll let you know when those breaks are coming up. Okay, so just to start with, Jeremy and I both hail from the San Francisco Estuary Institute, which is located in Richmond, California, and we are an independent science agency. Our goal is to assess and improve the health of waters, wetlands, and wildlife in the landscapes of San Francisco Bay and the California Delta and beyond. As our executive director likes to say, you know, we work from the top of the mountains to the bottom of the bay. We work as far north as the Klamath River and as far south as the Tijuana Basin. So it's a wide-ranging focus, but our main focus is San Francisco Bay. You can boil that mission down into a couple of key things, and these are the aspects of our institute that guide everything we do. We're independent scientists, and we inform management decisions through that science. We're tools-based, using GIS as well as other environmental informatics. And then, you know, what we essentially do is to monitor, assess, visualize the future, and then plan for how to achieve that future. The Institute's organized into 3 program areas. I am part of the Clean Water Program area, and that includes the Regional Monitoring Program for San Francisco Bay, as well as the Delta Regional Monitoring Program and our Nutrients Program. Jeremy is part of the Resilient Landscapes focus area, and that group looks at how basically historical ecology, you know, how the landscape has changed from what it used to be, and uses that information to help inform how we might do restoration to be effective. And then finally, our environmental informatics group helps us with GIS work, data management, data visualization, and overall informatics tools. So most of the data that I'll be presenting today is from the Regional Monitoring Program for San Francisco Bay. This is our 25th year, and it's quite an achievement. The program was founded in 1993 with a pretty simple premise. The premise was, if we have 100 different dischargers to the bay, and these would be, like, for instance, wastewater treatment plants, stormwater agencies, dredgers, refineries, other industrial dischargers, and all of those dischargers are doing their own individual monitoring, that there's collectively a lot of money being spent on monitoring, but there's relatively little information about the overall health of the bay, because all of the monitoring designs were very specific to an individual location. So some visionaries at the Water Board and in the discharger community made the decision back in 1993 to pool those funds that were being spent and to have an independent science agency, SFEI, do a comprehensive monitoring of the bay. So what started out as a logistical and common sense way of dividing up the labor has evolved into much more over time. The goal of the RMP is to collect data and communicate information about water quality in San Francisco Bay in support of management decisions. And, you know, this is how we've evolved over time, is we have become very focused on collecting data that is relevant to management decisions, and then using that information to communicate to managers and to inform those decisions. The RMP has 2 broad categories of work. The first one is our status and trends monitoring, and that's going back to the original purpose of the RMP, which is to monitor the whole bay in lieu of individual monitoring by certain dischargers. And we monitor water, sediment, as well as wildlife. And the wildlife we monitor are fish, bivalves, and birds. And so with those 3 different wildlife endpoints, we're able to measure bioaccumulation through the food chain from the water and the sediment. We monitor a wide range of pollutants, and those pollutants have changed over time as the management interest has changed. Early in the program, there was a large focus on metals. Some of those issues have been resolved, so we don't do as much monitoring for metals. Early PCBs and dioxins have been a concern in the bay for quite some time, so we continue to monitor for them. Currently, we monitor a lot for nutrients because that is an area of intense interest. And then we have a whole separate area on emerging contaminants, which are pollutants that are not regulated, and we're not sure if they're a concern, but we need to understand both their presence, their sources, and the potential risk associated with them. Aside from the monitoring, we have about 1/3 of our budget related to special studies. And over time, we've come to believe that not all questions can be answered through monitoring, that oftentimes we need to do a special study that's focused. It may last a year or 2 in order to answer a specific question. And our biggest focus areas for special studies are stormwater, nutrients, and the CECs. Going back to our mission, the communication of information is important, and we've produced reports every year related that summarize our monitoring data, as well as synthesize results from the RMP and other monitoring programs in the Bay. I won't go into these in great detail, but a lot of the graphs I'm showing today are from these reports, and the websites for the reports are shown at the bottom of this slide. Okay, so starting to talk about water quality, and the way we would start about water quality is to acknowledge that the Bay is a big place, and water quality is not the same in every place. We have a general, and so you'll be, as I'm going through the slides on showing data, you'll be seeing data from different locations and different types of locations. So I think the first thing to acknowledge is that there is a North Bay and a South Bay, San Pablo Bay, where hopefully you can see my mouse, where the rivers come into San Francisco Bay is very different than South Bay and Lower South Bay down here. The other thing to notice is the bathymetry, and there's often a discussion about the spine of the bay, which is this deep channel that runs through the length of the bay, but most of the bay is quite shallow. And so a lot of monitoring has initially been done in the spine of the bay. If you look to the graph on the right, you see this yellow area. These are the areas that we call the bay margins. And these are areas that are essentially mud flats. They are about 1 foot below low water up to the high tide line. They have traditionally not been monitored because it's difficult to get a boat into those locations, but yet these are extremely important areas relative to wetland restoration, because this would be the area immediately adjacent, and which would be affected by and would affect the water quality in the wetland areas. So in general, you can think of the bay as having the deep area along the spine of the bay, relatively shallow shoals as you move to the sides, then into the large mud flats in the margins, which is especially important in South Bay and Lower South Bay and San Pablo Bay. And then generally having this gradient from the north and Sassoon Bay down to the South Bay and Lower South Bay. I should also say that there's one other distinction, is that in Lower South Bay, there's very little flushing. Most of the flow from the rivers comes through Sassoon Bay, through San Pablo Bay, through Central Bay, and then out the Golden Gate, and vice versa. South Bay does not flush very much, and so the water quality of South Bay is typically of more concern because there's less dilution. Here's just a satellite image of the bay where you can start to see these areas like the spine of the bay and the sediment, where you can see the deeper channels. You can also see the shallower mud flats along the margins and the shoals. And then you can really start to see the landscape, which is this incredibly dense urban environment that rings nearly the whole bay, and is one of the reasons that it's challenging for water quality. While we often make a distinction between North Bay and South Bay for water quality, you can go to an even more refined system, which are these operational landscape units. And this is how Jeremy and his team are starting to think about geomorphology. These are areas that work together as a unit and where we have to think about management as a unit. And so you can take this segmentation of the bay to the next level when it's appropriate, and it's often appropriate at the restoration scale. Okay, so pollutants of concern in the bay, and this is moving into the second area of our talk, and I will pause at a couple of instances as we go through here. This graphic is from our latest pulse of the bay, and I like this graphic because it helps to show the full universe of pollutants of concern, but also some of the priorities. As you can see, there's a lot of different things that have been monitored and have been detected in the bay, but certain things float to the top in terms of concerns. And mercury and PCBs are key pollutants of concern. We have management plans, which are called total maximum daily load studies, that limit the amount of these pollutants that can be discharged to the bay. So these are major governing documents that are drivers for management for these pollutants throughout the watershed. Pathogens are also important in terms of swimming water quality at beaches, and dioxins is another issue that has been a concern in the bay from legacy pollution. The next level down, we start to deal with a lot of different things. It's a mixture of things like selenium, which is a metalloid that's related to discharge from the delta, and then we have to deal with some legacy pesticides, as well as we're starting to get into some concern about some of our emerging contaminants like fipronil, which is a pesticide from flea and tick control for pets, and nonylphenol, which is a surfactant, which is often related to cleaning products, and PBDEs, which are a flame retardant, which has been phased out. As I go through the rest of the talk, I was going to highlight a few of these key issues, and I was going to characterize them into three, or lump them into three groups. The known knowns, so things like mercury and PCBs, where we know a lot about them, but it's still an issue, and we're monitoring changes over time. The next group would be the known unknowns, things that we know might be a concern, but we don't have complete information. And then the unknown unknowns, which are the more of the emerging contaminants, things that we're just starting to get our hands around. So after each one of those sections, I'll pause for questions. Okay, in terms of known knowns, the main ones of concern in the bay are PCBs and mercury. These are pollutants that have been with us for quite some time, and we know quite about them, but they're still a challenge for us for management. PCBs are related to old industrial properties around the bay. There was a large military presence in the bay over time, and these are chemicals that were used ubiquitously in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. They are a bioaccumulative pollutant, so from PCBs that are in the sediment, they will accumulate into fish and then birds, and they're very long-lasting and very persistent. Mercury is a concern also is from a different source. A lot of us have heard about the gold rush, obviously, but not as many know about that we had one of the largest mercury mines in the world located in the Santa Cruz Mountains above San Jose on the Guadalupe River. This was a mercury was used as part of the mining operations for gold, but it also, having this mine itself for the mercury has been a source, particularly in South Bay. So then, starting to focus in on PCBs, what I'm showing now is a graph of sediment concentrations of PCBs in the bay. There's a couple of things to take away from this graph. The first is the spatial variability of PCBs. The redder areas are areas where it's higher concentrations of PCBs, and you'll notice that those cluster largely into the shorelines near Oakland and near San Francisco and in the South Bay area. And the second is the thing to notice is the overall trend in PCB concentrations, and that's the graph on the right-hand side. This is a spatially averaged a trend line from the monitoring we've been doing since 2002. And you can see a small, potentially small decline, but nothing statistically significant at this point. So so basically what we're dealing with the PCBs is legacy pollution from industrial activities that are taking a long time to be remediated or flushed out of the bay through sediment removal from the bay. You can see the same spatial signal in this graph, and this is a graph showing the concentrations of PCBs in a fish, which is called the Shiner Surfperch. This is a fish that lives in the margin areas and tends to have pretty good site fidelity, so it doesn't move around a lot, and therefore the concentrations in the fish are a good indicator of the concentrations in that area in the sediment. You can see the highest concentrations in the fish in the Oakland area, and next highest near San Francisco and South Bay. The concentrations are above the limits that have been set in the TMDLs, which is the purple line, and they're above some of the advisories for fish consumption for the bay, and that's one of the reasons why there are fish consumption advisories for the bay. Moving on to mercury and striped bass. So mercury, as I mentioned, has this large source in the South Bay from the former mining operations. And this graph illustrates that very well. Striped bass is one of the key indicator species for mercury contamination in the bay. And you can see in Artesian Slough, which is down near the South Bay area, the concentrations were highest in our most recent sampling event. I think mercury is obviously the other part about South Bay that is surely of interest to you all is the South Bay salt pond restoration. Concerns about release of mercury and mobilization of mercury from restoration is obviously foremost in the planning related to the South Bay salt ponds. So it's an interesting water quality issue that you're all, will be a challenge in terms of wetland restoration in the South Bay. The other part of looking at mercury is trends over time, and this is a graph that goes all the way back to 1971, which is this period of record for monitoring mercury in striped bass. And you can see that despite serious efforts for restoration, there is still no trend in terms of mercury in striped bass over this over 30-year period. It's been quite a long record, and we're one of the few places in the world that has such a long record of monitoring. And this lack of trend indicates the challenges with trying to control mercury in the environment because of the complexities by which it is stored in the sediments and then methylated so that they can become bioavailable and bioaccumulated into the fish. So I was going to pause there after the known knowns and see if there's any questions about the PCBs or mercury, since these are major trends, major known knowns for us in the bay.
So far, Phil, no one has put a question in the question box. So I would encourage you to just keep going, and we will keep you posted if somebody pops a question in there.
Okay. All right. So moving on to the known unknowns, and the way we're characterizing these is contaminants that we are concerned about in the bay, but we are still sorting out how they should be managed. Nutrients is a big one in this category. The nutrient issue, nutrients are a major issue towards managing estuaries worldwide. San Francisco Bay so far has not seen indications of a nutrient problem, but there's a lot of potential concerns. Selenium is another one, and those are the two that I'm going to cover. Some new pesticides would fall into this category, and I'm listing fipronil here because we've been collecting a lot of data on fipronil for the last few years. So at this point, we're starting to get our arms around it. But just maybe 5 years ago, it was just a new pesticide that was being used, and we didn't know anything about it. And it's progressed to the point where we now know a bit more. So there's a whole separate part of the RMP that's measuring nutrients, and it actually has spun off a different group called the Nutrient Management Strategy to monitor and assess the condition of nutrients in the bay. And this group is very active because the management decision related to nutrients is potentially very expensive. We had over 40 wastewater treatment plants discharging to the bay, and those are the predominant source of nutrients. The cost to upgrade all those wastewater treatment plants is well into the billions. And so there's a need for good science to help inform that decision. We've been focusing on a few key areas here. We've been doing some high-frequency monitoring of water quality, and these are sensors that you put in the water, and they measure your water quality every 15 minutes, especially for dissolved oxygen, which is what I'm going to present. Another large focus is on modeling, because nutrients have, unlike other toxic contaminants, nutrients are constantly changing forms and being taken up into phytoplankton. So it's something that's more amenable to modeling as a way to understand these changes in dynamics. Another focus area has been algal toxins, and these are also sometimes called harmful algal blooms. You may have heard of the large bloom that occurred last year of Pseudonychia offshore that closed down the Dungeness fishery. That fortunately did not come into the bay, but we are monitoring for other algal toxins like that in the bay, and doing some additional water quality mapping. So I was thinking of what section, of this large program area, what would be of most interest to you? And I thought the question of dissolved oxygen in the sloughs in Lower South Bay might be highly relevant. So what I'm showing on this graph is a map with the bathymetry and the far South Bay here. So here's the Dumbarton Bridge, here's the San Mateo Bridge. You can see this deep channel that works its way down into Lower South Bay, and then we have these shallow mud flats surrounded by the salt ponds and salt marshes of Lower South Bay. The dots on this graph show places where we're making high-frequency measurements of water quality, and in these cases we're measuring temperature and salinity and dissolved oxygen. So the way to look at this graph is now showing dissolved oxygen relative to tidal cycles at all the different places that we monitor. On the top graph is the Dumbarton Bridge site, and then the other graphs are stations in the sloughs, different sloughs. And the way to read it is basically the green and black dots are the measurements of dissolved oxygen. And the only difference between them is the black signifies when a measurement fell below 5 milligram per liter, which is the water quality objective in the basin plan. And the thin black line is the tidal amplitude. So this is a way that we can match up what we're seeing in terms of water quality with whether it's occurring on a high tide or a low tide. And the broad conclusions, without going into too much detail, is that at the Dunbarton Bridge, which is the top graph, we occasionally see dissolved oxygen below 5 milligrams per liter, but it typically stays above it. But as you move into the sloughs, and particularly things like Guadalupe Slough at the bottom, most of the measurements are below 5 milligrams per liter, and in some cases they're getting down to 2 or less than 2, which is the standard definition of hypoxia. So what we're seeing in general is that there's less dissolved oxygen in the tidal sloughs. And if we were to blow up this graph and look at the concentrations relative to the tidal amplitude, you'd see that typically you're seeing the lower concentrations on an ebb tide and not on the high tide. There's lots of questions about this. You know, low dissolved oxygen can be a natural phenomenon in tidal marsh channels. So there's, and it isn't necessarily a bad thing, but we're starting to get better information about what's going on with dissolved oxygen. And I should say dissolved oxygen is extremely important for fish habitat. So you know, restoration goals in South Bay relative to fish would be affected by what happens with dissolved oxygen. So our conceptual model of what's going on here is that when you have a flood tide, all lower South Bay gets filled up. So here on this graph at the far upper left corner is the Dunbarton Bridge, and this little schematic showing how the water comes into lower South Bay and fans up through these sloughs, and that would be like, you know, these channels that go up between the salt ponds. And that's generally, you're bringing oxygenated water in, and that is, you know, that's higher concentrations of dissolved oxygen. Whereas on an ebb tide, you can see how much water goes out of the system, and it collapses down to just this narrow little channel and a little pool here before the Dunbarton Bridge. And the water that has been up in these sloughs is drained out, and all that's in there is water that's either coming in from the rivers or is being discharged from the managed ponds. So that's typically when we're seeing the lower dissolved oxygen. So, you know, at this point, there does seem to be a linkage between you know, the managed ponds and the wetlands and the dissolved oxygen in the sloughs. So I just thought that would be of interest to you all, to see this connection between the water quality and the restoration efforts. The other known unknown that I was wanting to mention is selenium. And selenium is a particular concern for sturgeon. And we've been monitoring sturgeon throughout the bay for many years, and the most recent sampling effort is shown here. And you can see a gradient from North Bay to South Bay. So in direct opposite to the graph we looked at earlier with Mercury, the higher concentrations are found in the North Bay for selenium, and the lower concentrations are found in the South Bay. And sturgeon are very long-lived, and they live throughout the bay, but they also migrate up through the delta. We've been catching them in Sassoon Bay as part of a fishing derby, and being able to monitor them and try and understand how they're accumulating the selenium, and also determining ways that how we can monitor selenium in the fish using non-lethal methods. This graph shows the selenium concentrations over time, going back to the 90s and late 80s. Similar to Mercury, we have not seen much of a trend in the concentrations of selenium in the sturgeon. There have been some major management efforts done in the 90s by refineries that removed selenium from their waste streams. Right now, a lot of the mercury that's coming into the system is coming from the San Joaquin River Basin, and so we're trying to monitor the effects of changes of water management in the delta and how that might affect selenium and sturgeon. Okay, I can take another pause here and see if there's any questions so far.
Questions are rolling in, Phil. Get ready. But we're going to start you with an easy one. So back to your focus on Mercury, there's a question Can you please provide some context on why we are quote unquote so unsuccessful at mercury removal? Does our long record of monitoring suggest that either one, our efforts aren't working, or two, the problem is not solvable?
All right, I'll do my best at that, and I'll preface that to say that that's a difficult question, and I don't know that I'm the right person to answer that question from the highest management level. The mercury is a complicated pollutant in that the steps that lead from a piece of elemental mercury that may be released from a watershed to the bioaccumulation into a fish, there's probably 15 or 20 different steps. And it focuses, a lot of people focus on this question of the methylation step, where you're adding a methyl group to the elemental mercury, and that typically occurs in low dissolved oxygen environments and high organic matter environments. And so when we monitor for mercury in the sediments, we measure for those covariates in order to try and understand that methylation pathway. So it is a challenge. I think people have fairly good models to understand it, but we have not fully cracked the code. And the question of whether it's worth continuing to focus on, I would look at this graph here that I'm showing and saying that since we are dealing with concentrations that are higher than our objectives for being able for fish consumption, it continues to be a management priority, and we should continue to put effort to try and crack this code and understand how we can get back down to our water quality standards and the ultimate goal of the Clean Water Act of fishable and swimmable waters.
Excellent start to what I agree would be a very long conversation, but we have other forums, including discussion at the advisory committee itself, where we can delve into it more if the group chooses. So I'll just say also that we did receive through the comment box more references to other mercury studies that have been led by the South Bay Salt Pond Project, so we'll provide all those links to everybody so that if you do want to delve deeper into mercury, you have other resources available to you. So we'll share that as a way of summarizing the webinar after it's over in a couple weeks probably. We do also have a question which links PCBs and mercury together. Can you please comment on the ranges of depths that we find PCBs and mercuries, and the difference perhaps in concentrations in depth? And this is a multi-part question, so there's the depth issue. Mobility and effects from dredging, and potentially wave effects or prop scour.
Okay. So let me start with the PCB part of that. We see a general trend of higher concentrations of PCBs in the shallower portions of the bay. And we think that has a lot to do with just proximity to the sources. But it got an interesting well, the other part of that is the shallower portions of the bay tend to be the ones that are more bioactive and have a bit more, more fish, more small fish. So there may be a bit of a nexus between having higher concentrations in the shallower margin areas and the persistence of these pollutants in the food chain, because they're being taken up and bioaccumulated in those areas. And that's why the RMP has started to focus a bit more on the margin areas, thinking that if we're not seeing a change in some of the concentrations in the whole bay, maybe we really have to focus on the areas where some of this initial loading and uptake is happening, and see if those problems are more solvable in those areas, and that could have a greater impact on the overall bay. The mobility part is certainly important. The bay, as I'm sure all of you know, gets very high winds. We often get large wind waves, and waves going over shallow mud flats are going to mobilize sediment and move it around, and that's why we sample down to 5 centimeters when we do our sediment, because we know essentially we're dealing with a fully homogenized mixed layer at that depth, that there's not a lot of strata within the bay. So contaminants are being moved around that way, and through dredging, contaminants are also being moved around. There is a whole testing protocol related to that to determine where and how sediment dredge material can be either disposed in the bay or reused, and that's like a whole other topic which is very interesting and important, and the RMP is involved in, and I will actually have a few slides about that at the end.
So Phil, I would, we do have a couple more questions, but I think I want to let you kind of finish your slides because we're going to run late. I can see it already. So go ahead.
All right, I'm going to move along. All right, thank you all for those questions, and I appreciate people providing additional resources about Mercury and South Bay. I am not, so that was more than I could provide, so that's helpful. Okay, known unknowns, and I can do this pretty quickly. We deal with this a lot. I mean, we all, pharmaceuticals, personal care products, new pesticides, as we all know, the pesticides are ever evolving. There's sort of a never-ending list. I think the latest number I heard was 100,000 registered chemicals, and we only, at the most we would ever regulate on is 127. So we're dealing with emerging contaminants is a huge issue, and just knowing what to even look for has been a challenge. To help us with this, the RMP has a strategy for emerging contaminants, and we have dedicated staff to this. They do a great job of keeping on top of the literature and latest findings, and also looking at product use data in order to decide what we should target for our monitoring. One example I'll highlight, and this is a multi-year example, is PBDEs. PBDEs was a flame retardant that was in basically everything that could have, and we had a California standard that was specific to, or California standard that was very strict that led to the high use of this chemical. Back in the early 2000s, we determined that there was higher concentrations of PBDEs in this area than in many areas, and that is kind of the outproduct of being a 7 million person region with relatively low flushing in South Bay. Through our monitoring, we were able to help inform the decision to phase out some of these products, and then through the monitoring continued, and we could see a decrease in the concentrations, which is shown by the declining trends of PBDEs in our bird eggs, and that's a cormorant at the top of the graph, and that's one of the species that we monitor. We got very good press on this and some good publications. So this is a good success story of catching things early and phasing them out. We're just embarking on a new series of studies related to microplastics, and this is an emerging issue, and so I consider this on the different end of the continuum, where we have relatively little data and we're still just trying to get our arms around the current status. And the way we do that is through doing a conceptual model that will allow us to think about where these contaminants are most likely to be found and how they're migrating through the system, and then potentially what kind of pathways we could use or could be targeted for reduction efforts if needed. So I think of interest to you all, I wanted to cover the fact that sediment quality and quantity is also important as part of the RMP. And we try and be useful, and I wanted to highlight here the questions that we have driving our sediment program, and I think a lot of them will resonate with you all. We want to talk about, we want to know what is the chemical quality of dredged material that can be disposed, and using our data to help answer that question. What about impacts to biology from dredging? And where and how much dredged material can be reused? What are the sources, pathways, and loadings of sediment? And then how much sediment is available for restoration and other uses? I'm sure you're going to be grappling with a lot of issues similar to this, and hopefully our data can be useful to you. Yeah, so just stepping through those, those main questions, I showed the graph earlier of the PCBs in sediment. This is a graph showing the PAHs in sediment. We, at this point, have over 700 samples around the bay. We use these data to calculate the trigger values for bioaccumulation testing for dredge materials, as well as setting the TMDL limits, which govern where and how some dredge material can be disposed. Essentially, the question of can it be disposed in bay or out of the bay is determined by this TMDL limit. Another aspect of the sediment monitoring is just the suspended sediment. Up to now, we've been really talking about the bedded sediment. So the suspended sediment is what's in the water and moving around, and the USGS has been monitoring these suspended sediment at 5 locations throughout the bay with RMP funding, and then they also monitor a few other locations with their own funding. Similar to the nutrient program, they're measuring these turbidity and other things every 15 minutes. So what you can start to do with this data is, since we've been measuring it since 1993, is look at these long-term trends. And this is a very classic graph from USGS showing the long-term trend of suspended sediment at the Dunbarton Bridge and a significant decline in recent years. You may have heard of the term bay clearing. This is the clearing of the waters in the bay. Dave Scholhammer at USGS has attributed some of this change to the pulse of sediment that was released by hydraulic mining during the gold rush finally working its way through the system and having less sediment supplied to the bay now than we had previously. And sediment supply, so concentrations are one thing, but you can turn that into loads or sediment supply. And it's a graph that Lester McKee from our program produced showing that the loads of sediment from the delta to the bay vary dramatically depending on the type of year, and that we can have up to 35-fold difference in the sediment supply overall coming into the bay from the Central Valley. So we get that information from measuring the sediment concentrations at a location where you also have flow and putting those two things together to measure the load. And then, the loads and things can be combined ultimately into simple models to figure out the mass balance or the budget. How much sediment is coming in versus how much is going out. And not just for the whole bay, which is what's listed at the top, but also for the lower South Bay, where the flow in and out of the Dumbarton Bridge depends largely on the amount of fresh water that's come into the system. In wetter years, you have a net outflow of sediment, which is like in 2012, whereas in the drier years, you have a net inflow of sediment. So these overall sediment budgets are going to be important for figuring out how much sediment is in the bay, how much can be removed, how much can be reused, and where. And at the extreme end, we always have to, one of our biggest challenges is understanding the sediment flux out of the Golden Gate. And this last, in 2016 and then in 2017, during the higher flow periods, USGS was out at the Golden Gate doing profiling in order to measure that flux, because it's a huge number and it really is important to get the error bars in context, or to understand that outflow in order to close the budget for sediment. So I can pause there for any questions about the sediment aspects, and then I'll be turning it over to Jeremy.
I'm going to give you one question, Phil. We do have other questions, but you did cover this at the beginning of your slides, but we have had another question clarifying or wanting clarification on how the RMP functions. How does this data inform management decisions? Who gets this data, and how does it inform what we study and over what period of time? Can you just give us a refresher on how the RMP works and who the quote-unquote management agencies are that sit at the table?
Sure. So the steering committee for the RMP consists of the Water Board, representatives from the wastewater agencies, representatives from the stormwater agencies, representatives from the Bay Planning Coalition, and the Army Corps, and the industrial dischargers, which like the refineries, for example. I think I'm not forgetting anyone. That's on our steering committee, and as part of the technical committee, we have a broader group, including EPA and Baykeeper and others. So the main, the data that we present is sorry, I got to think about how to summarize this quickly. The Water Board is a key management agency in terms of water quality in the San Francisco Bay, and so the information is filtered up to that agency for making decisions. It's also a group decision among the steering committee and how to summarize the results of all this information that's relevant to the management questions, and then making sure that information is available in our Pulse of the Bay reports that can be used by other agencies. We also have work groups that include a broad array of participation, and for example, in emerging contaminants, DTSC and DPR are participants and help us to plan our studies so that the results of the studies are useful for them. So it kind of starts at I guess it's a top-down in that, and bottom-up in that the steering committee consists of agencies that can make decisions, and bottom-up in that we involve as many interested parties in our planning of studies before we actually embark on them to ensure that the studies are relevant.
Thank you, Phil. So I'm just going to do a check-in because we're obviously very near where we were going to end, but we are not going to end. We are going to be joined by Jeremy Lowe as our next speaker. We are going to, I assume, I think we're going to go half an hour over, so I will understand if people have to drop off. For the questions that we haven't been able to get to, we will strive to forward them to the presenters and produce questions, which will be shared with all the participants after the call, and along with the resources that have also been given to us related that I mentioned earlier on the Mercury. So I'm also going to say that Jeremy is calling from very far away, so I'm not sure if the phone quality is going to be the same, but feel free to let us know if you have trouble hearing him. But I am assuming at this point that we are transitioning to Jeremy.
Yes. All right. So Jeremy, just tell me when to advance the slides.
Okay. Can everybody hear me?
I can hear you.
Hello? Okay,
yes,
good.
we can hear you.
I'm far away. I'm close to the phone, but I'm far away in Minnesota. So I'd like to talk about finish by putting the water quality and sediment supply issues that Phil has been talking about is the context of restoration. And talking about restoration in the Bay, the obvious starting point, a great resource that we have completed in 2015 is the update to the Bayland Goals report, which looks at the potential impacts of climate change, but also the other issues about sediment supply and water quality to the wetlands and the impact that might have on wetland restoration. So I would urge everyone to make sure that they're well grounded into this book. It's a great synthesis of the science, and it provides a great background to the work that we've been doing at SFEI and looking ahead about the types of impacts we're going to have on restoration. Next slide. So tidal marshes, we do care about tidal marshes a lot. They provide ecosystem services. They do polishing of the water. They improve our water quality. They dampen the impact of flooding that we have in the Bay. They're obviously important wildlife support functions that they have here and provide a lot of the food web that supports the ecology of the Bay. And also there's a lot of aesthetic and recreational uses to these tidal marshes. But in doing so, we should also think about the role that water quality and sediment has on those marshes themselves. Next slide. On your left-hand side here, you'll see a historical ecology study that we performed of the East Bay, looking at where fresh water used to enter the system, how water got through the marshes, from the upland areas. It generally entered the back of the marshes, and they created freshwater and brackish marshes, and then progressed into saline marshes. Not like the system we have on the right-hand side, which is our present-day plumbing of the Bay, where we have wastewater treatment facilities, concentrating the flows, treating the water, and then passing it out into the bay as into deep water outfalls. So we have a lot of differences in the amount of water and the quality of the water that's entering the bay. And so we've been thinking about how the water can be incorporated into the future landscape that we have. So we're planning for, not just in terms of restoration, but in terms of resiliency to climate change we're expecting. New slide. So what we're interested in is how to reconnect some of these missing pieces so that we create better marshes, but we also provide some of those more ecosystem services such as wastewater, the polishing of water and the disposal of sediment onto the marshes, but to increase their accretion. So we have a number of studies. This one was looking at the connections between creeks and the marshes themselves. At the moment, we have flood risk management levees that cut right across the bay, the marshes, and take the water straight out to the bay. We're looking to improve the connection between the marshes and the creeks so that we can create salinity gradients across the marshes to increase habitat diversity, but also so that we can get sediment to accrete more rapidly on the marshes themselves so they can keep up with sea level rise. We've also been looking at how water could be introduced along the front of levees and long slopes, which sort of emulate the upland transition zones, which we've built our cities upon, but we could then not only provide areas for habitat today in the upland areas close to the marshes, but we can also look for areas in the marshes to transgress into or migrate into as sea level rises. So there's a number of aspects there we've been looking at in concept. Next slide, please. And then as Phil mentioned, we are looking at what we call operational landscape units. We're dividing up the bay into areas in which restoration should be undertaken as a coherent whole. There might be individual projects, but those projects should fit together. And so in looking, this is an example from Novato Creek. This is the operational landscape unit where we'd be thinking about, well, we could do restoration close to the bay in Novato Creek to reduce the flooding impacts and provide more marshland. Obviously, we have Highway 37 in place, and we would need to raise that. But also in the upland areas adjacent to those wetlands, we should be thinking about how to reestablish those zones. Maybe the water coming from the sanitary district could be polished as it seeps through those levees and those wetlands to create those saline salinity gradients, but also to provide some polishing, and also looking for depositional areas to take the water, the sediment out of the Novato Creek and place it onto the landscape. So we're trying to think of things, not just the restoration, but also how sediment and water moves through here. Next slide, please. And of course, when we're talking about those large areas and the regional areas, and Phil touched upon this, we need to bring together all this information. And this is an example of the role that we have at SFEI of bringing together regional data together. It takes in data from the regional management plan program, which Phil has been talking about, and also from tracking of projects, of restorations, and so on. Bringing it all together into a central repository called CEDN, which is the California Environmental Data Exchange Network, which SFEI is responsible for Northern California, and then putting that data which is collated together and then putting that into useful form, next slide please, which is into visualizations and into information that managers and decision makers and project proponents can use. So EcoAtlas is a prime example of this, thinking about how to use this information gathered on a regional level to help understand the types of projects we need to do at specific locations, and to look at how those projects contribute to the health and the water quality and the wet administrations that we have throughout the bay. So I think that takes us kind of full circle from what Phil started off as how do we use this information effectively in the management of the bay. And that's me finished.
Okay, so Lisa, that's all we had. I'm sorry this went longer, but we could stay on the line for a little bit for some questions.
Yeah, that would be great. We're checking to see if we have any additional questions from Jeremy's slides, but I can go back to some of the questions that we got during your section. So there's a question, were there any extreme weather events associated with high peaks in the late 1990s? So have we done any comparison? Do we have any data sets from the 90s that can be used in comparison to what we've just experienced in 2016 and 2017? I assume that's related to the sediment slides that you just showed, the sediment flux.
We have some information. It's not complete. The best information we have is in the Guadalupe River, and those are related to the sediment flux and particularly the mercury flux coming out of there. And we were fortunate to get a great new data set from that this winter. So our staff are working up that data, and we'll be making that comparison pretty soon. So at least for that, we have good information. At the Golden Gate, it's a very hard measurement to make, and so we don't. I think we had measurements, I think, in 2002, if I'm remembering correctly, and so we don't have it, during an extreme flow year, and that's why it was important to get information this year so that we could get the high flow information.
Could either you or Jeremy speak a little bit to Phil, you introduced the topic of the bay clearing and what the change in suspended sediment concentrations in the bay means to sediment accumulation in our margins, which become our marshes. Can you go over that concept a little bit to strengthen the relationship in everyone's minds about what that means to marsh restoration in looking at sea level rise rates?
Sure, I'll start, and then Jeremy, you can add. Just the sediment is, the bay is actually at a high level. It operates as a one basin where this sediment comes in from the delta as well as from all the rivers that discharge directly to the bay, and then there's a large outflow of sediment out the Golden Gate. And that balance of inflow and outflow controls how much sediment there is in the basin that could be reused. And the movement of sediment up into the margins and then to the marshes is extremely important for keeping up with sea level rise. So if the overall supply of sediment to the system is going down and the losses from the bay are staying the same, then the amount of sediment that's available for keeping up with the sea level rise is going down. So that's the big picture perspective. And Jeremy, could you go off from that?
Sure. So yeah, we do have just as we have accelerating sea level rise projected, we also have we're projecting a reduction in the overall sediment supply to the bay, which is unfortunately happening at the same time, because that, as Phil pointed out, we need to keep the relative position of the marshes relative to the tides in place. Luckily, at the moment, we have relatively high marshes in the bay, and so the projections that the Bayland Goals gave was that that our marshes should be able to keep up with about 8 to 10 millimeters of sea level rise. Keep us at about 2070 or so on with current projections. But at some point, we're going to start to see some of our habitat conversion or change as the marshes become more inundated. And so looking ahead, part of some of the aspects I talked about before, thinking about transition zones, the upland areas behind become more important, because in a more natural system, we would expect to see the marshes to migrate, to move as one of the responses to sea level rise. And of course, we built levees and walls and so on directly behind our wetlands, which stop that movement. So we've got to think ahead more of a landscape point of view, thinking not just on the wetland restoration, but what else are we restoring directly behind it to allow space to move. We're also thinking about how to move better use of the sediment that we do have. We have a lot of material that's being dredged at the moment, and there are different ideas about how to use some of that material. Some of it is used to fill up some of the deeply subsided salt ponds and other diked areas, such as Hamilton. A large amount of material used there. But we also need material to help maintain the elevation of the existing marshes, and other ways that we can augment accretion on mature marshes. And there are a number of studies looking at how we could maybe use natural processes to augment the suspended sediment concentration over the marshes to increase their viability into the latter part of the century. The other part is that if we can change or we can reestablish some of the salinity gradients, then we will be probably having greater organic productivity on some of our marshes. And you can see that if you go into Sassoon and into the Delta, they're very high rates. There are other ways in which we could encourage that higher organic productivity by reconnecting some of the freshwater inputs into the marshes. Another opportunity there. So the Wetland Goals does spell out some of those ideas, and they are actively being worked on in pilot projects, and I would urge the group to pay attention to the experimentation that's going on in the Bay at the moment.
I think the only thing I would add to that is the complexity of the sediment movement within the Bay, and what we're seeing during high flow years where there's a lot of fresh water coming into the system, that it changes the net movement of sediment into and out of lower South Bay. During wet years like this, there tends to be net movement out, whereas in the dry years, the sediment is net moving into the marshes and the margin areas of lower South Bay. So it's the changes in the weather and the precipitation patterns affect the movement within the Bay as well.
Yeah, thank you for making that distinction. We had one other question as we talk about sea level rise and its impact on marshes. That the question is whether it's been considered, does it have any impact specifically on legacy pollutants or contaminated areas? Do either of you have any thoughts on whether that has been looked at?
Well, that's an area that we've been starting to think about, and I think the extreme case of inundation of industrial areas that were near the Bay that were dry before, but that may be inundated in the future is of concern. We have not looked at that in great detail, but it's one of those future planning things that we're thinking about. So that's again driving the overall interest of our program to collect better data in these margin areas so we know better what we're dealing with. When the RMP was founded, you really did not have shallow draft. Well, the focus was initially on the main part of the Bay and places that you could access with a boat that had a 3-foot draft. Now that we know the importance of these margin areas and how increased sea levels and maybe increased erosion in these areas might be mobilizing sediments, we're now getting into those areas with shallow draft vessels to collect samples. It's much more expensive because you can't collect as many samples at once, but it's important information, and that's the focus of the program right now.
We do not have any other questions coming in, so last chance, everybody. While we still have Phil and Jeremy on the phone, we have covered all the questions that we've received in the question box. And again, we will plan on, so this has been recorded. We will share the link so that it can be shared again with those that could not be with us today, as we will with our other future webinars as well, and share resources in the summary. So we're not as late as I thought we were going to be, but I will take that under consideration for planning the next one to appropriately time. So thank you, everyone, for sticking with us. Looks like we're 10 minutes over. And unless anyone has any parting questions, we will wrap it up. Jeremy and Phil, thank you very much for your time. I know you are both squeezing this in with all your other work, so I super appreciate the time you've taken to share this information. And I'm sure we will be reaching out to you again.
No, it's our pleasure. Thank you for the opportunity, and I appreciate everyone's attention. And You have my email here. If you have any other questions about the RMP, please just shoot me an email directly, and we can talk offline.
Great. Yes, we'll share your contact information as part of the slide packet that gets shared with everyone else as well. All right. Thank you, everybody. #1 webinar done. Talk to you.